Hello, everyone. Welcome to Transform Now. I'm Brad Hairston. My guest today is Miguel Carrasco, the Global Public Sector Lead at BCG X. He is based in Sydney, Australia. And Miguel has been on the podcast twice before. So you need like a jacket or something for a third time appearance.
I get frequent flyer points, Brad.
There you go. Frequent flyer points. But I'm thrilled to have you back, Miguel, to discuss the AI maturity matrix. This is a report that Miguel co-published with some of his colleagues. It's a really interesting piece that takes an objective look at the impact of AI around the world, and I really look forward to discussing it with you.
Great to be with you again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Why don't you remind our listeners about yourself and your role at BCG?
Yeah, thanks, Brad, and thanks for having me on again. So I am a managing director and senior partner with BCG, and I'm, as you said, I'm based in Sydney. My role is twofold. One, I lead the Centre for Digital Government, which is BCG's global centre of excellence for all things digital and AI related in public sector. And I'm also the lead for BCG X for the public sector. BCG X is our tech design and build unit that actually builds solutions for clients. And we're doing that in the public sector a lot these days. So nice to be with you.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for taking time with me here right at the end of the year before we all go off and get some rest and relaxation for the holidays. So really appreciate that. So, Miguel, I mentioned the AI maturity matrix, really interesting report. The subtitle was, "Which Economies Are Ready for AI?" And this caught my attention, number one, because we talk a lot on this podcast and other forums about AI from, an industry standpoint. We talk about the technology underlying it. We talk about data. We rarely step back and look at it from a geographical standpoint and really think about which countries are ready for AI, which are, not quite ready for different reasons. So I found the report very informative, and I want to dive into that with you here today. So I guess the first question, what was the driving force behind creating the AI maturity matrix?
Yeah, it was a really interesting piece of work that we did with my colleagues to develop this matrix. And the main reason we wanted to do that was because AI is obviously having a very transformative impact on business, on governments, on economies overall. And that it was fundamentally a game changer. It radically changes the economics, the ways of working. And we really wanted to understand how different economies were doing in terms of their evolution and their adaptation to this game-changing technology. And there are a number of other indices or matrices and sort of readiness indicators. Most of them tend to focus, though, on the digital or the technology aspects. What we really wanted to look at was not just the digital maturity or the AI maturity, but the readiness of economies to respond to the opportunities and also the risks and the threats. So by combining both the maturity and the readiness, you get a better sense of whether economies, how well placed they are to take advantage of the opportunity, and how well placed they are to navigate through the disruption that AI is causing.
And the index that you and your colleagues came up with, can you talk about how it captures the nuances of AI readiness across the different economies?
Yeah, so there are two dimensions effectively to the matrix. One is about exposure, and the other is about readiness. And so the exposure of an economy is largely linked to the mix of industry sectors that it has. So some sectors in the economy are obviously much more susceptible to AI-driven automation, or they are also growth engines. So you think of the ICT sector, for example. If you have a big ICT sector, AI is driving enormous growth in the technology sector at the moment. So different economies have a different mix of industry sectors. Others are less exposed, resources and energy, agriculture and so on, to say compared business services or professional services or retail and things like that. So you on the y-axis, you look at the exposure of different economies to AI, both sort of opportunity and threat. And then on the x-axis, what we have is we use the Aspire framework as a way of assessing readiness. Aspire is short for ambition, skills, policy and regulation, investment, research, and ecosystem. And what it does is it takes a comprehensive measure of how well an economy is doing. Ambition, for example, looks at the whether you have a strategy or an agency that's responsible for AI. Skills is about the level of skills and the maturity of skills in the workforce. Policy and regulation looks at the extent to which you have the right governance frameworks and guardrails for responsible AI. Investment looks at obviously the level of investment that's going into AI capabilities. Research and innovation is about how the ecosystem is driving innovation. And then the last part is really about infrastructure. So the extent to which you have cloud, the availability of cloud services, energy prices, broadband infrastructure, and so on. And when you take that holistic view, you can see that some countries do well on some elements, but not others. And the interesting thing is that the AI pioneers in our matrix score very highly on all 6 dimensions.
The infrastructure component alone seems to be a challenge for every country around the world. There are not enough data centers, not enough energy to go around. But I love the fact that you cover so many different dimensions in the way that you assess readiness. I mean, that's a pretty broad assessment. So in your report, you identify 5 countries that you call the AI pioneers. That's Canada, mainland China, Singapore, the UK, and the US. What is it that makes these countries distinct in their approach to AI?
So the first thing is that they score very highly on every single one of those 6 dimensions, but particularly around the level of investment. If you look at the AI pioneers, the amount of funding and commitment of investment from both the public and the private sector tends to be much higher than the other economies. And so that is a real differentiator. The other thing they have is skills. So a real focus on attracting talent, AI talent from other countries using visas or incentives to bring talent into the country, and also developing homegrown talent, significant investments in workforce upskilling in AI, data science, digital capabilities, etc. And then lastly, the research and innovation clusters that they've managed to create. Canada's a good example. They've really gone out and created some terrific clusters for innovation, bringing together academia, the public sector, the private sector in different precincts. And that those precincts and those clusters really drive innovation more rapidly. There's also, I think if you look, for example, at Singapore, the work they've done to establish a regulatory framework for AI creates certainty or a sort of guardrails, in particular for, say, responsible AI. and all the elements that are required, that provides an environment where everyone can work within and understand what's expected in the rules, etc. And then clearly the leaders like China and the US just have a massive amount of computing infrastructure and cloud availability of cloud services and data centers, etc. And so when you look at it holistically, they have made significant investments in infrastructure and people. They've put the policy and the regulations, and they've got the strategies in place to really drive it.
You mentioned what Singapore's doing. Is that something, that approach to the regulatory, the guardrails, is that something that smaller nations like Singapore can emulate and that are like following their example?
Yeah, I think Singapore is a good example of how you can take a very strategic approach, and a very targeted approach. Singapore is one of the countries that actually has a very high level of exposure in that AI matrix. So they have a significant proportion of their economy is linked to financial services and business services, which are highly susceptible or are more exposed to AI automation.
Right.
So it's good to see that they are responding proactively to try and prepare and anticipate that. They have had an AI strategy for some time. They put in place a number of regulatory frameworks to sort of, the responsible AI frameworks. There's tools that help businesses and governments that are implementing AI solutions to be able to assess. I think AI Verify, it's called. It helps them assess their compliance with those sorts of frameworks around expectations around transparency, explainability, repeatability, the role of humans in the process, etc. So I do think they've been strategic in their approach in terms of making very specific interventions. And finally, of course, on the skills side of things, Singapore is well regarded for making significant investments in skills in the workforce, trying to upskill the population, make sure that they have the capabilities, and that is at scale. That is really investing in AI capability uplift across the whole workforce, and that also puts them in a good position to take advantage of the opportunity.
Yeah. It's interesting because I just had a customer of ours from Singapore on the podcast to talk about their journey. And for them, citizen development has been a huge focus. And it's really helped them, proliferate it across their organization. And it sounds like that's consistent with what you see in Singapore in general with
absolutely
AI. Yeah, that's fascinating. So the countries that are not quite in the pioneer category, the adopters, the AI adopters, what can they learn from the pioneers, especially in areas like balancing ethical considerations with innovation, that trade-off that countries have to make?
Yeah, I think so. The steady contenders and the AI contenders in our matrix, where they can really focus is on that skills dimension. So the some of the biggest gaps between the pioneers and the others is the extent to which they're investing in talent development and skill development. Some of them are doing really interesting things, but at a small scale. So the question is, how can you scale that up across a much larger population? Then there's the sort of targeted approach of attracting talent into the country. So visas for skilled workers and in particular work with these types of AI, data science, machine learning skills. The other thing that they can do is ensure that there is the right cloud infrastructure in place. So a lot of the capabilities associated with AI require significant compute power. So that means investing in sovereign AI capability, like sovereign AI models, and also the data center and cloud services infrastructure, sovereign cloud infrastructure that's required to run some of those models. And then finally, at a minimum, making sure that they're in really putting in place the right regulatory frameworks and responsible AI frameworks, and trying to create some level of certainty and clarity around expectations. It's the problem is when you have uncertainty and people aren't sure sort of where the guardrails are, then that tends to hamper investment and innovation. So I think the more that you can do also to connect the business community, who are often the demand drivers, with the government, who are often the regulators, and academia and the universities, where there's a lot of innovation happening, and really creating that positive dynamic and interaction between those different parts of the economy. The AI pioneers, I think, have got a very collaborative model across all of those sectors, and that I think is also something that the contenders can focus on.
So Miguel, with regard to economies with low AI exposure, like those that are reliant on agriculture, how can they prepare for future technology disruption?
Well, those countries that have a lower AI exposure tend to have certain sectors in their mix of industry sectors which are potentially less susceptible or less at risk of automation and so on. But there are great opportunities for those countries as well. So one thing is potentially diversifying their economy into other sectors that could be drivers for growth. So how could you see a lot of this in the Middle East, traditionally oil-rich, resource-rich nations that are proactively trying to diversify their economies, and particularly trying to increase their exposure to the technology and ICT sectors. And I think that's a good example of sort of creating economic growth and economic development by deliberately trying to influence the industry mix and sector mix of the economy. And actually creating more AI exposure isn't necessarily a bad thing. It could actually be a huge driver of growth and jobs in the future. So that diversification beyond low exposed sectors can be a really good thing. But even in those sectors potentially which have low exposure, there are opportunities for AI. There's in agriculture, for example, a lot of analytics and predictive models, farming optimization, so that there's a lot of weather patterns and how do you optimize fertilizer usage and things like that. So agri-tech and the adoption of advanced AI in the agriculture sector has the potential to really boost yields and productivity in those sectors. And so that I would say, even for low exposed economies, it is an opportunity to look at where could you use AI to drive more productivity and more economic growth. And that will still require many of the same things: investments in infrastructure, investments in skills and capabilities to drive that.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's talk about what governments can do to kind of move things forward. I mean, what do you believe are the most impactful actions that governments can take to improve the AI readiness of their countries under like the Aspire framework, for example?
Well, starting with the A of the Aspire framework, the first thing is to make sure that there is a clear national strategy for AI, and that has very specific, actionable, programs and initiatives in it, and that there's a body or an entity that's responsible for driving and leading the implementation of that strategy. And I think that is something that the AI pioneers have been doing now for several years, updating those roadmaps and those plans over time. So it's a dynamic strategy, not a set and forget. And that I think then creates some a vision and some anchors and some pillars for the other parts of the Aspire framework. AI talent development, I think, is a big game changer. I think the more that you can encourage individuals to learn and sort of take advantage of the opportunities. There's usually a lot of things already available, and all of us individually probably have to adapt our mindset to continuous learning and a willingness and an openness to explore the new technologies and understand what they can do. We've done research earlier this year which showed the more that you engage with and use AI in your everyday life, the less fearful you are, and the more optimistic you are about the benefits and the opportunities that it can provide. So that increasing level of awareness and exposure in the workforce will then drive further innovation and productivity, because people will see what the opportunities are, where they can use it and adopt it to save time and spend time doing other more valuable things. And I think we're seeing that in the evidence play out. There's a lot of good examples where AI and Gen AI tools, for example, are taking out 4 to 6 hours a week of toil, things that people are not necessarily, that they can be very routine and very unattractive tasks. And so if you can take some of that toil away from people's jobs, it actually makes people's jobs better and more satisfying. And that's where I think there's a real opportunity to, in a more widespread way across the economy, across all the different sectors. How could you adopt it?
Yeah, that's great. So as you just think about the report, the research that went into it, and the disparities that it highlighted as a result of the research, what are the long-term societal implications of that?
The interesting thing is that obviously there are there's some clear leaders in the AI pioneer category, the UK, Canada, the US, China, Singapore. And whenever you have a sort of advantaged group, there's a risk that other economies start to fall behind, and that it's not possible to catch up, and it creates potential for dependency. So those economies which are not the pioneers become dependent on the technology and the solutions and the offerings of those countries and those economies which are more advanced, and that bifurcation can create a gap, and that can also lead to or contribute to geopolitical tensions and other destabilizing and negative effects. So I do think that the important message here is to really understand what the level of exposure is and make sure that your readiness is at least keeping track with your level of exposure. And there's, for each of the economies, the 73 economies that we looked at, it's possible to see where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are, and then focus specifically on addressing those gaps as much as possible. And I would like to see, I think, the more that we can close those gaps, the more we can maintain some sense of equitable economic development across the whole, the whole world.
That's great. I'll definitely put a link to the report in the show notes so people can reference it. I'm sure people that haven't seen it are going to want to definitely take a look at it. It's definitely got some great insights. Well, Miguel, as we wrap up, I thought I would just throw a couple of questions to you, just related to some of the things you talked about, but just from the perspective of being in Australia, being on the other side of the world from me, some big topics that I know we've been talking about and dealing with on the podcast with guests and such. One is, the resourcing, the talent search and finding the tech resources that are needed. That seems to be a huge challenge. And in the US, at least, we continue to see the numbers show this, that the big tech companies are still gobbling up the majority of those resources. But we are seeing some of the big banks start to enter the fray. It's becoming kind of a hot job for a lot of people to go work at a bank because they are just as eager to hire AI talent as the big tech companies. What are you seeing from your side of the world on that front in terms of how the talent management, talent acquisition, talent retention challenge is going, and where do you see the talent going in your economy specifically?
Well, I think it's probably very similar, Brad. I think a lot of the talent has been focused more in the tech sector. And when you look at the adoption of AI by different industry sectors, you definitely see the more advanced sectors are TMT, technology, media, telecommunications, and then closely followed by financial services and banking. So that there are some sectors that are really pulling away in terms of their AI innovation, the adoption of AI in their organizations, the way they're embedding it into their ways of working and their processes. And I think that's highly correlated with their talent pools and the access to talent that they have. That some of that research we published earlier this year in our Build for the Future survey, which is also available on our website. And you can see there that the key success factor in many of those cases has been attracting talent and creating a critical mass of capability in your organization. And it creates a challenge for other sectors, in terms of how do they compete. Sometimes they can't necessarily offer the same sorts of remuneration and, attracting, being able to attract the talent with the same sort of salaries, etc. In the public sphere, for example, which often has that challenge, you really have to attract people with something else, and that's the opportunity to create a greater societal good. AI has a massive opportunity to transform healthcare, education, infrastructure, agriculture, and so on. And so, what we need to do is get people excited about the ability to create public value and solve massive societal challenges. Climate change is another one, and the energy transition, where AI can have a significant impact, potentially helping us reduce and manage the demand for electricity and energy, which then helps us address some of the challenges of meeting our climate change targets. So I think there is so much that we could potentially do with the technology. In fact, the issue isn't what can we use it for and how could this help, but how can we get more scale. One of the trends we've seen this year is companies and adopters of AI are really starting to move well beyond use cases and pilots and proof of concepts to really thinking about how do I embed AI into the organization as a lever for transformation and really radically transform how the ways of working, the roles and redefining roles. If you can dramatically reduce and automate 30, 40, 50% of a job, you've got to fundamentally rethink that role and what it should be about. So that's exciting, that transformation and how in doing so we can achieve some of the objectives and the priorities that we have as a society.
You mentioned in there energy demand, which is certainly spiking quite a bit from the surge in AI in the U.S. and in the surrounding countries. What I see is somewhat a down prioritization of the decarbonization effort that was really building steam for a while. Now just to meet the increased demand, countries are having to kind of rethink their strategy, and even in the U.S. we have a kind of a revival of nuclear energy, which I don't think anyone expected, especially with companies like Microsoft, basically building an AI data center right next to a nuclear power plant to draw energy from it. So what are you seeing in your neck of the woods with regard to, just that trade-off between we still want to decarbonize, we still want to do what's right for the environment, but we've got this increased energy demand that AI is bringing with it?
Yeah, I think there is a good, robust debate happening about the energy mix and the solutions that are available, and which ones are going to be, what's the right mix of different types of energy solutions in order to meet the demand, and that will be different from one country to another, given their access to different resources and energy sources. I think the costs associated with different energy generation are also continuing to evolve and change over time, and so it is quite a dynamic environment. We can influence the demand profile. And as I said earlier, there's ways of using analytics to really optimize and try to minimize the demand for energy, and that obviously then reduces the gap or the challenge that we have in trying to meet that energy need. We're seeing continued increase in the uptake of and the generation from renewables and low emissions and zero emissions technologies. So I think and there's a lot of innovation happening in other spaces, and some of that innovation is what's going to help us achieve that objective in the long term as well. So I think the interesting question I pose or like to sort of debate with people is sort of how could technology, how could data, and how could AI help us meet the challenge of climate change and the energy transition? How could we use it to better manage demand? How could we use it to optimize supply? And I think there are some really good initiatives underway to try and match that supply and demand as best we can. And I think this challenge is not going to it's not going to go away. It's something we're going to have to continue to evolve and adapt over time.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, hey, Miguel, it's been great having you back on the show. I really appreciate it. This AI maturity matrix is, as I said, I think very, very informative. It's a different way to look at what's going on with AI. And I think you guys did a great job on that. So I'm glad to give it some visibility and make sure people are aware of it. But thanks for being here. I'll have to send your 3-timer jacket, your way here. See.
Well, thanks very much, Brad. And I should say to your audience and your listeners that in addition to being able to download the report on the website, there is also a visualization tool that you can use if you want to see how different economies are performing. You can select different benchmarks and different peer groups, and you can see, the spider diagrams across the whole Aspire framework. And that is quite a dynamic way of looking into the data and understanding, what the different where different economies are, where the strengths and weaknesses are.
Yeah, beautiful. That's great. All right. Well, thanks again to you, and I wish you all the best in 2025.
Thanks very much, Brad. Look forward to seeing you in 2025.